Ukrainian President Zelenskyy says he would guarantee a non-nuclear status for his country in order to end the war. His remarks come as concerns grow Russia might resort to tougher tactics. With the Kremlin controlling one of the largest nuclear stockpiles in the world, some are wondering what next steps Russia could take to move its military offensive forward. So joining us now for more on this is Ian Williams. He is the Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ian, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Let's start with these launches that Russia has engaged in recently, several long-range caliber cruise missiles out of the Black Sea last week. Of course, this shows how Russian forces are digging deeper into their military arsenal. How significant would you say this recent escalation is?
Well, it seems to be, this continuing pattern of as Russian ground forces become more and more frustrated and their attacks on the ground seem to get cut down by Ukrainian forces, they're using more and more long-range precision-guided munitions like the cruise missiles that we saw them fire last week. And I think, we can expect to see more of these kinds of missiles, these sea-based missiles, being fired because they are among some of the more reliable missiles that Russia has. One of the real surprising things that we've seen is a lot of Russian missiles have been failing. It's particularly a lot of the ones they have been firing from aircraft have been crashing or missing their targets. So I think we can expect to see them rely on these kinds of sea-based missiles more. But they certainly seem to be digging a little deeper into their arsenal, as you said. Something else we saw that was interesting last week is them fire what normally would be missiles they would use against ships, anti-ship missiles. They've actually repurposed to target targets on land.
Of course, we certainly don't want to be sensationalist, and some say that this talk of what will Russia do next sort of plays into their hands, right? The Russian offensive has faced significant resistance on the ground in Ukraine. Could it be enough to prompt the Kremlin to shift tactics and possibly take up nuclear arms, though? Again, without wanting to be sensationalist, just where do you think that breaking point might be for someone like President Putin, who is not making up the kind of ground he would want to have made up at this point in the conflict, and probably is afraid of losing face if he backs down?
Well, it's very hard to predict Vladimir Putin because he's obviously shown himself to be so unpredictable thus far. I do think that a nuclear use in Ukraine is unlikely as long as there is no NATO intervention. I think he's probably keeping that card as a deterrent for direct NATO military action. That being said, the United States, where Russia has a lot of military advantage is not so much in big strategic missiles the kind of world-ending city busters that both countries have, but is in these smaller tactical nuclear weapons, things that would be used on the battlefield that you could use against an airfield. They're still very highly destructive, and they still have cause a lot of radiological effects, but they're a lot smaller. And Russia has a lot of these. The United States gave up most of these after the Cold War. We still have a small handful of them based in Europe. And right now, that's really our only, in terms of military capability, our only real credible deterrent against Russia using this kind of weapon.
Right. So to elaborate, are those the only measures the U.S. and its NATO allies have in place to deter Russia from possibly using any of its nuclear arsenal?
Well, I think that's the most direct capabilities to deter, right? Vladimir Putin has shown himself not to be concerned with the humanitarian consequences of his actions. So I think that the thing that he responds to most is the threat that the threat of what he would gain from such a strike. The consequences would outweigh the gains, and I think the only way to deter that is to have a credible response on hand in kind.
I want to ask you really quickly before we let you go about the specter of chemical weapons. Do you think that has a more likely chance of being utilized by the Russians?
I do think that is more likely. I still think it's fairly unlikely because, again, I think the worst nightmare for Vladimir Putin right now would be some kind of direct military intervention in NATO, and that would certainly move us more close to that possibility. But I do think that it is a possibility, and I think we'll see it. If we see it, it's going to creep. We'll see something. We're already seeing use of things like thermite and white phosphorus. I think that is moving in that direction, not technically considered chemical weapons, but is in that kind of gray area. And just like we saw in Syria, we saw sort of seeing low-level uses of things like chlorine, gas, and then which slowly, gradually escalated up to more serious,
so Ian,
agents.
really quickly, because we're running out of time, how can we stop the creep then, right? If it's a slow creep, how does the U.S. and the NATO allies stop that?
Well, it's a difficult situation. I think President Biden's speech the other day helps a lot. I think giving the voice of the commander-in-chief saying that kind of thing is unacceptable and that we would respond in kind is a good step. But ultimately, if we cannot convince Vladimir Putin that the consequences of doing so would outweigh the benefits, it could be hard to deter that.
Ian Williams at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you.